My secret power is super responsiveness. Like my name is pronounced Zal, and like one of my founders actually changed my name on their phone to better call Zal. Having somebody like me who could be sitting next to you and helping you build your business, taking it from seed to Series A and beyond, I think is not something that a lot of VCs are able to do. I'm on top of everything with our founders. And I think that's what allowed us to get on a lot of these cap tables.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. When we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship today, about the process of taking a great idea and turning it into an impactful and profitable company, we're almost always, to some extent, talking about the world of venture capital. But the fact is, if you're listening to this show, then I probably don't need to convince you of venture capital's importance to the innovation economy. You already know all about it, maybe even firsthand. So I want to use this introduction to spotlight something maybe you don't already know. Someone, actually. He's responsible not only for the modern form of venture capital as we know it today, but also for a lot of the associated ideas around the function of entrepreneurship and what makes businesses successful. His name was Georges Doriot, and he is frequently known as the father of venture capitalism. He was born in France in 1899. His father, Auguste Doriot, was an automotive pioneer who helped build the first motorized vehicles for Peugeot. Following a brief stint in the French army, Georges emigrated to America in 1921 to pursue an MBA at Harvard Business School. Ironically, considering his later career and status, he never actually earned that MBA. He dropped out to take a job on Wall Street. But he was intelligent and impressive enough that he returned to Harvard Business School in 1926, not to finish his degree, but to teach. With a brief interruption for his military service in the Quartermaster Corps in World War II, for which he earned both a Distinguished Service Medal, the highest honor available to non-combat personnel, and the nickname The General, Doriot would hold that Harvard teaching post for the next 40 years, revolutionizing both ideas of business leadership and the methods of teaching them, and producing a generation of disciples who would go on to change the face of American industry. Ralph Hoagland, the founder of CVS, Philip Caldwell, the first head of Ford Motor Company, not from the Ford family, and John Diebold, founder of the Diebold Group and pioneer of the concept of an IT department, were all among the so-called Doriot men who counted him as a mentor. So what did Doriot teach that made him so influential? Well, frankly, a lot. But most of it boils down to a few key ideas: an emphasis on technology and constant innovation, the need for disciplined and long-term business planning, and the importance of leadership to an organization. And the how he taught this was just as important. He insisted that students spend time doing fieldwork at actual companies to observe the people running them, and required a project in which students would research an industry and make projections about where it would be in 5 years, an exercise that spawned the idea of the 5-year plan as part of corporate strategy. He was famously quotable. My favorite, the one I think that sums up his work the best, is this: always remember that someone, somewhere is making a product that will make your product obsolete. But incredibly, Doriot's deeply influential work as an HBS professor isn't even the main reason we're talking about him today. That reason, as I alluded to, is his work running American Research and Development Corporation, or ARDC, an equity firm which he co-founded in 1946 with a goal of boosting the post-war civilian economy by investing in promising but untested businesses in emerging fields like engineering and technology. Now, to be clear, Doriot obviously did not invent the idea of investing in new high-risk, high-reward enterprises. In modern economic practice, that's been around since at least the emergence of transferable joint stock shares in the 17th century. But by the 1940s, the financial world had become very conservative, understandably, given the preceding decades of war and economic turmoil. New businesses had an extremely difficult time accessing capital because banks did not want to extend loans to companies without a proven track record, especially when those companies were in developing fields, say computers, where no comparable companies for reference even existed yet. What we'd now call venture investment was generally done privately, with money coming from wealthy families or individuals, which meant that you had to be in or adjacent to those networks to have a shot at accessing it. What Doriot pioneered was creating a firm to which anyone could go for that kind of seed capital for their startup business, provided, of course, that they could convince him of its potential and their capability to run it. It took some time for Doriot's strategy to pay off, but when it did, oh boy, did it ever. In 1957, Doriot and ARDC made a $70,000 investment for a 70% stake in a technology startup called Digital Equipment Corporation, founded by two MIT engineers with a mission to build smaller and cheaper computers. Dorio patiently worked with and guided Digital as he did with all of his ARDC portfolio companies, which he affectionately called his children, over the next 15 years as they transformed the technology industry with their quote-unquote mini-computers. When Dorio and ARDC sold their stake in Digital in 1972, the company was worth over $400 million. I'll save you time on the math. That's an ROI of over 70,000% on Dorio's initial investment, which made pretty much everyone realize that there was some serious money to be made in this whole funding new ideas business. Many of the second-generation VC firms, names you've heard like Greylock and Fidelity Ventures, were founded by ARDC alumni. Venture capital completely revamped the American economic landscape. Indeed, revenues from venture-backed businesses alone make up as much as 21% of the modern US GDP. And it's all thanks to the general, Georges Doriot, father of venture capital, a name you should know. And another name you should know in VC, and one that I'm excited to introduce you to today, is Zal Bilimoria, co-founder and solo GP of Refactor Capital, and my guest on today's Consensus in Conversation. I was super stoked to get to talk to Zal on mic because he's actually secretly been a part of the show a couple of times already, as Refactor is a seed investor in previous guests, Checkerspot and Aether Bio. In fact, his and Refactor's name kept popping up so much around the exact kind of companies that I get excited about that I figured, hey, let's get right to the source here and get this guy on the podcast. And I'm so glad that I did, because his mission to help scale transformative hard tech solutions to human and planetary health into profitable companies is something that we're really all about here. Zal's had an incredible career journey as well, spending time at titanic names like Microsoft, Google, Netflix, and A16Z, before taking the leap to co-found Refactor, where today he's not just a GP, he's the GP. I was dying to learn from him what it's like to be a solo GP and to hear his thoughts on the state of venture and impact fields today. I'm guessing you are too, so let's dive into the conversation. Where I want to start, actually, tell me what it was like growing up in Indiana. Is that where you're from originally?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Indiana. My parents moved from India 50 years ago, and my dad was a metallurgical engineer, a steel engineer. And so a bunch of the steel mills in the U.S., they're either in Pittsburgh or they're at the south end of Lake Michigan in Indiana. So Gary, Indiana, which is, notorious for being the murder capital, but also Michael Jackson's place of birth. We lived about 15 miles away and in a really nice little town about an hour from Chicago. So we were part of the larger Chicagoland ecosystem. It was good because there was quite a few Indians in our town, which kind of made it a lot easier to kind of assimilate and have kind of cultural exchange, et cetera. But it was a great place to grow up. So yeah, I was born and raised there and stayed there until I went to college.
Growing up just outside of Gary, Indiana, did you have any sense for what you wanted to be when you grew up?
My dad on the side also had a computer business. So he was a serial entrepreneur. He had a couple of stores that he ran. He did a couple of startups, but in the middle, he ran this computer business. And I was conscripted child labor from age 6 onwards, believe it or not. And so we were building computers in our basement and then selling them to people's homes. We did doctor's offices, museums, libraries, school systems. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. We were selling 386, 486 computers, Pentiums with Windows 95, or even before that, Windows 3.11, And so I think for me, that was a really great way to get into hardware, software, and coding at a young age. So to answer your question, I grew up with technology and always had it kind of in my blood. And I went to Penn and I did the undergrad Wharton program. And I don't know if you know, but like 90% of Wharton undergrads go into 2 industries, banking and consulting. I did internships in both. I hated both of them. And so I was very lucky that Microsoft came to campus and recruited me to be a product manager. And that started my 10-year career in product management. So in some ways, yes, in some ways, no.
I feel like half my banker colleagues coming out of college were all from Wharton undergrad program. It is the fuel of the analyst industry.
Yeah.
But you didn't study computers at Penn. You studied economics.
Yeah. So I didn't do computer science. I did the Wharton undergrad with, business degree. I also did a couple of study abroads when I was there, one in Spain, one in China. I really enjoyed traveling abroad, learning new languages and learning about new cultures and history. And so I could have probably grabbed on and, to another major, but I wanted the flexibility of being able to travel. And for me, I think I appreciated having the business fundamentals, especially now as I'm in venture.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's been a benefit in disguise.
What was it like to head into Microsoft straight out of college at that point in time? Yeah. I just finished listening to Acquired's 3-part series on the history of Microsoft. I'm a huge Acquired fan. I think they do great storytelling around corporate history. And so I'm really, I literally just finished over the weekend. Curious what like your personal experience was like at Microsoft.
Yeah. So this was summer of 2004. I joined Microsoft right after college. It had just been named the #1 employer in the world to work at by like 2 or 3 different publications. And I moved across the country from Philadelphia to Redmond. And I was there for 2.5 years. Steve Ballmer was CEO. Bill Gates was kind of running around as an advisor. But at that time, Microsoft didn't really understand the internet and wasn't kind of taking full advantage of what was possible. And, at that time also, Microsoft stock kind of just hovered between 25 to 30 bucks a share, producing a small dividend, really not moving the market cap at all. Windows Vista launched while I was there, which was kind of a bit of a disaster, actually. And there was a lot of discussion around tablet PCs back then that was like based on Windows, and they had the Media Center version of it as well, which you can plug into your TV and watch movies and do video games. But that was really the extent of how they were thinking about the internet. It was really disappointing, to be honest. And so I was on the emerging markets team for Windows, and I quickly realized like this is not where my career needs to be. A, up in Seattle, and B, at Microsoft. And so I was lucky I had some friends at Google, and they're like, Zal, we just had the IPO a couple of years back. We're hiring like crazy. You should come on down. And so I ended up interviewing and joining in 2006, 2 years later. And so that's when I moved here to the Bay Area almost, 18 years back.
I mean, you've worked at some of the coolest, best spots. We don't have to touch on all of them. I do want to take a second to hear a little bit about your time at Netflix, because you basically created an entirely new role as the head of mobile there. And I mean, that was a revolutionary point in time for them, for consumers in digital media. So how did that happen? And what did you see in the market at that point in time? Because I think this probably is a great prelude to talk about how you see things well in advance in venture. What did you see happening in the marketplace that made you want to be there at that moment?
Yeah, so when I was at Google for just about 4 years, most of that was at YouTube, actually. So I had experience in video streaming platforms and in building product there. I was on the monetization side of the house. I left to start a company in the consumer mobile space. We were building a new mobile app to kind of replace Google Reader, the RSS reader, after it had gotten shut down by Google, like a really comprehensive news source for people to be able to use on a mobile-first ecosystem, so on your phone or on your tablet. Unfortunately, we ended up shutting down that company. And then, I reconnected with a friend of mine from Netflix who was VP of product, and he told me that they didn't have a dedicated mobile PM. And this was about 6 months after Steve Jobs had launched the iPad. And I was like, how do you not have a dedicated mobile PM? Oh, somebody else in the other department's running that right now. I'm like, no, this is going to be, this is the future. You got to like have somebody. And so I literally like put together a presentation and presented it to Reed Hastings and the executive team along with the VP of product, and basically helped create this new role of head of mobile. And so this was in 2011. And at the time when the iPad was launched, Netflix was actually one of the first apps to be pre-installed. And like Steve Jobs had it on stage. It was like the icon was up there. But it was literally just the desktop UI that you would have with your mouse and keyboard with the white background and like all the buttons. And it was just stretched out onto a tablet or smushed onto a mobile. And so it basically had all the UX, the user experience, in terms of a point and click interface. But there is no pointing and clicking necessarily in phone and tablets. But it's very, very small buttons. It's really easy to do that with the mouse on your computer, but much more difficult to do it on tablet. So I went and rebuilt that entire stack with a very small team inside of Netflix. And, we tried to create something that was extremely mobile responsive. Even like having the black background, that was novel for Netflix. And then making it so easy for people to actually just swipe through content and see what they were interested in. Because there was 2 main metrics at Netflix that all of us PMs were geared toward. One was retention. So keeping people paying $8 a month, right? And then the second is streaming hours. The more likely you are to stream on Netflix, the more likely you are to retain as a member. So it's the most highly correlated variable to retention, because retention is really hard to move. At the time, we had like 30 million members. I think there's over, 150 or 200 million now, but it's really, even with 30 million, it's really hard to move that statistically in an A/B test. But you can move that with streaming hours. And the whole point is, how do you get somebody into content as fast as possible instead of like going through and browsing and not finding what they want, and then maybe going to another app and watching something else, right? Which would obviously be a negative for retention. And so we built this phone and tablet app from the ground up, completely redesigned. And typically you run these A/B tests for 3 to 6 months. But we had data after about 6 weeks, after the first retention window opened up, that showed both streaming hours were through the roof and retention was materially moved. And it was one of the most successful product launches in Netflix history. And so Reed allowed us to open it up to the entire base right before Christmas of 2012, I believe it was. And so it was awesome. It was a really great experience.
That's amazing. As you think about just that one experience, that one moment in time, any key lessons learned that you have carried with you since, that just, whether they would be lessons from Reed or from, Netflix in general, what sticks out as big lessons learned from that time?
Yeah, I mean, like not only just at Netflix, but I guess 10 years of product experience, like the role of the PM is extremely different at every one of these tech companies, even though most of these companies I worked at were here in Silicon Valley, right? And so on Netflix's side, it's a very PM-centric culture, meaning I got to make most of the decisions, which is kind of crazy, but it's a very kind of CEO-oriented structure. And the engineers, the designers, the marketers, everybody kind of looked up to me as kind of figuring out what the roadmap and the strategy and the execution plan was going to look like. If you look to the opposite end of that spectrum, you look at maybe Facebook, where PMs and engineers are very much kind of on even pages. And so they make decisions together. Google and YouTube were probably in the middle somewhere, where I had some authority, but I had to defer to my engineering colleagues on other issues. And so I think every company was really structured differently. And I think it had its own benefits for the culture at the time. And so I had a blast at Netflix because I had a lot of authority and a lot of success. But I think each tech company that's being built today has to kind of figure out its own culture and where to actually design their product, because every startup is a product organization and they have to be thinking about that from day one. What type of product organization do I want to build?
Yeah. I've told so many younger colleagues, if you think that you want to go into the startup world and learn how to build a company, there's no better place to do it than one of the big tech firms as a PM. And to your point, it almost doesn't matter where, because while each culture is different, each type of product management team is different, universally, the skill sets are going to give you the foundation. And then from there, you can kind of hone in on the kind of product that you might develop might help lead you to your next spot. But I just think it's such a great training ground for building product and building companies, frankly.
I mean, you hit it right on. And I think that's why I got lucky, not to just fast forward here, but when I was at LinkedIn and Andreessen Horowitz was recruiting me to join as a partner on the investment team, they were looking for my phenotype, people who were former founders, former product managers, who technically could understand how to build products, but also commercially how to sell them, because that's what you need to do when you evaluate companies for investments.
Yeah.
And Ben Horowitz, Mark Andreessen, Chris Dixon, a whole bunch of other folks there were actually former PMs in their career. So they were basically just looking for junior versions of themselves. This was back in 2013, 2014 when I was there. And that was kind of the phenotype for the investment team that would go and support the general partners in evaluating and making investment decisions.
I actually want to talk about your time there, because I think one of the interesting things about it was that you began to focus on a different space, which was healthcare and biotech. So what led you to make that shift?
Yeah, so I had just joined I think it was September 2013. I was told that, let's, based on your background, you've got consumer and SaaS experience. Let's go look for some interesting software companies and help us evaluate those. And I spent a little bit of time in that in the fall of 2013. But then we hired this amazing guy that you may have heard of, Balaji Srinivasan. Right. So Balaji came in and he was our first health and bio GP. And we ended up looking at investments together and doing the seed round of Benchling. We did the Series B of Amada Health. We did a few other interesting bio and healthcare companies. And the reason that I got excited was I was kind of done trying to find the next Snapchat, to be honest. Mm-hmm. I wanted to leverage my technology and software experience in something more meaningful. And Balaji kind of got me hooked on digital health, computational biology, and synthetic biology, and that general intersection of life science with computer science. And to me, yes, I didn't have an academic or operating background in anything related to bio or health, but being able to use my software experience in these areas, I think was a very, very interesting transition for me. And I latched onto it because I had the A16Z business card and I could email anybody, any founder on the planet and be like, can you tell me about your business for a half hour to an hour? And I used that to my advantage to meet with hundreds of founders, some that we were not evaluating actively. And I obviously gave very clear expectations of that, but I wanted to be in learning mode. And I just soaked it up like a sponge. And Balaji was kind of my impetus into this field 11 years ago.
That's amazing. And I can't imagine how easy it is to open a door with an A16Z business card.
It is insane. Like if you want to go into learn about a new company, a new sector, you want to go to a big company and try to understand like what they're thinking
Yeah.
about in terms of a new area. Like we had a huge Rolodex of people at Google and Facebook and Apple that we could call on when we're like, are you guys thinking about this area that we're just looking at right now? And so would you think about partnering? Do you think about this as competition if we invested in a startup? And so it was really amazing to be able to have that at our beck and call.
So what was the impetus to then strike out on your own?
Yeah, so we had just launched the Bio Fund. So Balaji got the crypto bug, as everybody knows, and now he's trying to start a crypto nation, which is awesome. His PhD advisor from Stanford was Vijay Pandey, so we brought him in and convinced him to stick around, and he was the first GP on the first Bio Fund back in 2015. Right now, A16Z has dozens of funds, and I think 500 people. When I joined, there was about 50 people there, and everything was out of like one monolithic fund, $1.5 billion. And so this bio fund was kind of a very new experiment, a $200 million vehicle just to go after that intersection I was talking to you about, computer science and life science. And Vijay was the GP on that, and there was a few of us that was working with him on that. It was about then that I realized that I was kind of ready to start writing my own checks. And so I had the conviction and the courage to be able to kind of think about, okay, who do I want to go do this with? And so I reconnected with an old friend of mine from Google, David Lee. David was running SV Angel with Ron Conway way back in the day, obviously, but he had just left SV Angel and he was getting into bio and health as well. And so he was thinking about starting something. And so we started riffing on ideas and came up with Refactor. And yeah, I gave my notice right before the holidays in December 2015. And David and I started Refactor at that point. Yeah, almost 9 years ago.
What was kind of your initial elevator pitch back then? And has it changed? What is it now? How would you kind of...
Yeah, so initially we wanted to start a bio and health fund because that's what we both were very interested in. But we got a lot of pushback from any LP from in fundraising saying, what, you guys are Google consumer people, like you should really have a broader mandate in terms of the types of industries that you want to invest in because you guys are going to get amazing deal flow from all parts of the planet and every sector. So we said, okay, we'll broaden it to hard but not impossible industries, which we thought were like, okay, heavily regulated industries that were getting upended by software and technology. That was the one-liner that we used in Fund 1. And bio and health were going to be our majors, so to speak, but transportation, construction, manufacturing, fintech, some crypto, because David was really into crypto as well. I'm a bit of a crypto bear, but I think we were able to kind of cast a much wider net in that first one when David and I were GPs. And then he decided to retire in 2018. And that's when I became solo and have stayed solo since then and really focused in on the bio and health in Fund 2. But then so much of the synthetic biology stuff I was doing was in food, chemicals, plastics, and materials. It ended up being climate investments. And I was actually pretty good at it because some of my companies were doing quite well in those categories. So I made climate and bio in the last two funds, including this one, the two majors of focus.
So what fund are you on now?
So I just closed Fund 4 earlier this year, $50 million fund. I'm a solo GP, nobody else here at the firm. It's just me. And my plan is just to raise $50 million every few years for the next couple of decades if I can do it. And just focus on seed stage investing, primarily in climate tech and biotech. Hard tech in general are these categories that I'm excited about. So I am kind of seeping into, the energy and battery space. And I just did my first nuclear-oriented investment. I've done a couple of things in aerospace as well. So things kind of broaden out from climate and bio into hard tech. And I'm loving that because I think you constantly want to be reinventing yourself every few years, especially as an investor, because it keeps your networks fresh, it keeps your ideas fresh, and you're kind of looking for where the next category is going to be.
Yeah. As you think back to like that first fundraise with those first LPs, was there anything that stuck out to you as really surprising about how they viewed either your approach or your CV? And how has that changed over the last four funds? Like, what's the evolution of fundraising look like?
Yeah. I mean, the first two funds were still really brutal to raise because, Fund 1s are really challenging. Like it took us over a year to raise Fund 1. Fund 2, after David stepped back and I became solo, that was also over a year to raise. And so I think even with David invested in Twitter, Uber, Airbnb, Snapchat. I mean, SV Angel has an amazing portfolio.
Right.
And he was responsible with the team to kind of invest in a bunch of these amazing businesses. But we still had challenges in trying to get to 50 million in our total fund commitments. And so I think it's, they wanted to kind of see what the portfolio was going to look like. So halfway through the fundraise in Fund 1, we started making investments, obviously, because we did our first close. And then the tenor of the conversations changed completely. Whereas, like, what's your strategy? What's your portfolio construction? To why did you pick these companies? And like, how did you win a position on this hot deal or on this cap table? And what's your thesis? And how do you plan to reserve for that company and support that business? Once it's shifted to actual businesses within the basket that these LPs would be buying into, it became so much easier to close them.
Yeah. And what do you, I mean, this conversation's ebbed and flowed a little bit in the last few years, but there's certainly been moments in the last couple of years where the big VCs, the funds are just so effing ginormous. Like they're raising and raising and raising to the point where I'm always trying, and I know there's a lot of people that talk about this, like how effective can you be as a, fund 17 is 7 billion, like versus, you're going to go raise 50 and only 50, and you're going to deploy it in seed stages. And like, what is your take on kind of that trend towards some of the behemoths being, giants in fundraising? And like, how do you succeed at that level? Is it easier? Is it harder?
I think it's, for the large funds, it's kind of like tech, right? We have the Magnificent Seven right now in the stock market. And I feel like we have something like that or some number like that that's sitting at the top of, every founder's desired wish list for their Series A and Series B, right? These are funds, to your point, that are multi-billion dollars in size. They are trying to dip their toes in seed, but they don't do like traditional $3 to $4 million seeds.
Right.
Their seeds are minimum 10, 15 million, which used to be a Series A just not only 3 to 5 years ago. Right. And so they've got to write the larger checks. And honestly, even a $10 million check is, that's just a waste of time.
They don't move the needle. Yeah,
exactly. And they don't want to take a board seat because that is their most precious commodity. And founders forget that, right? Their most precious commodity is their time and the number of board seats that they're on. So they love doing seeds because seeds typically don't have a board seat. You can just get away with board observer. But when you start writing $50, $100 million checks, you need a board seat. And most GPs tend to max out at like 15 to 20 board seats. I mean, there are some crazies out there like Vinod. Vinod Khosla is on like 60 boards, and he has just the energy and the enthusiasm and the team to help support him execute that. But most people tap out at around 20. 25 max. And then it just becomes really like you can't do any new deals at that point. And then you got to go hire new GPs to go and help you do new investments. And that's why so it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Where you're constantly writing these bigger checks. You've got to take the board seats, but you've got to go hire more GPs because your fund sizes are so big and you've got to go deploy more capital.
Right.
And so A16Z went from when I was there 10 years ago, 7 GPs. My understanding is they have like 50 GPs today.
Yeah. It's
So
a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle. And, it's a treadmill that you got to go and run really fast on, right? And they're raising these funds, every couple of years. But, they're going after, it's kind of like the old adage of IBM in the 80s and 90s. You don't get fired for buying IBM. You don't get fired for buying Microsoft, back in the day. Here, it's like if you're an LP at Yale, at Harvard, at Northwestern, and you've got $100, $200 million check to deploy, do you put that into 20 managers like me and have to spend 20 amount of time on like diligence and writing $5 million checks? Or do you write that into A16Z? Maybe you're not going to get a 5X or a 10X, but you'll be happy with a 2X because it's just above the S&P 500 over that time period.
Right. What about, you mentioned it, but I want to go back. How did you get onto some of those cap tables, those first few funds? So now we know how you got the fundraising done. How did you get the deals done?
Yeah, so I think, again, we were really lucky because David had a stellar reputation among founders already via SV Angel. A16Z, as an A16Z spin-out fund, whether we marketed that or not, that's kind of how people thought of us. And I think that really helped because A16Z was a new brand back then. And it just started 5 years prior, right, in 2009. And it was the new darling. And so the talent coming out of A16Z and my particular class of investment professionals that was working with the general partners, one of them went to become a partner at Y Combinator. One of them built a company and sold it for $2 billion. It was like a really good cohort and people recognized that. And so LPs recognized that in our fundraise, but then I think founders did as well. And so I think the other thing that was kind of a little bit of my secret power, I think that David also had, but he saw that in me, is super responsiveness. And so I intimated before our call, like my name is pronounced Zal, like Better Call Zal. And like one of my founders actually changed my name on their phone to Better Call Zal because like he was always calling me for advice or like, however small or large the issue is. And I think that responsiveness, having somebody like me who could be sitting next to you and helping you build your business, taking it from seed to Series A and beyond, I think is not something that a lot of VCs are able to do. And I'm like a type A plus personality, so I'm on top of everything in terms of like communications with our founders. And so I think they appreciated that, and I think that's what allowed us to get on a lot of these cap tables.
So how do you balance that? Because you are a solo GP and you have a decent number of companies in your portfolio. How do you stay sane and stay eager communicative with all of your portfolio companies? And why stay a solo GP at that point? Like, how's that have you thought through that process for yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, so my goal is to get them to graduation, which is usually a Series A. And so I spend a ton of time with my companies that are in the pre-seed seed stage and getting them from that 0 to 1 to Series A, right? The 1 being Series A. And after that point, because I'm writing a $1 to $2 million check for 10% ownership, I'm a major investor. I'm one of the leads or co-leads of the seed round. I'm usually sticking around as a board observer for at least one round. It can be time consuming, but it's much less time consuming than being the actual board member because I don't take board seats. I only just take board observer roles. And so it allows me to have a lot of flexibility once the companies graduate to kind of pass the baton to the next set of VCs that are on that board. And I'm still a first phone call for a lot of these companies, like companies that have raised, Series C and Ds, and some of them like who have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. They still want to call me for like advice before they go to their board. And I love that. I'm not always like that person, but it's nice to be able to maintain that responsibility because it is an important responsibility. But if I'm investing in 7 or 8 companies every year, which is my typical average, I would say about 4 or 5 will graduate to Series A every year historically. Maybe 2 or 3 will shut down or get acquired. And so you're talking about a 1-to-1 effective replacement rate in terms of me removing 7 to 8 companies from my kind of active slate and adding 7 to 8 new companies as my active slate. Now, there's probably a 20% error rate in any given year on that, but I can manage that buffer on my end. And so for me, like, I don't really want to deal with a partnership of people. Like when David left, I had the opportunity to bring on another GP and spoke to quite a few. And if there's like 10 steps in the GP marriage process, I only got to step 2 or 3, let's say, with anybody. Maybe there was a culture fit. Or I remember one of the guys who was like actually one of my LPs is a founder of a multi-billion-dollar company. We were talking about like starting up, but he wanted to go and build like a $500 million fund as the terminal value and be multi-stage. I was like, I don't want to do that. I just want to focus on seed. And I want to focus on these hard tech problems, these hard areas versus trying to go into like, consumer enterprise SaaS, which I exited a while back. Right. And so people had different ideas of what they wanted to build. And I was just like, you know what? It's going to be hard. I'm going to raise this fund too at that time in 2019. And I'm going to have to rebuild a lot of my LP base because a lot of folks left because they didn't like manager changes. But it was like the right thing to do because I knew I wanted my independence. I enjoyed my authority. And I got to decide which founders I wanted to work with every day. And so to me, like that allows me to stay sane and say, okay, I'm going to raise 50 every few years. If I went to 75 to 100 million, I'd have to write either bigger checks, like $2 to $4 million checks, and I'd be less collaborative with other seed funds, or I'd have to write, 50 to 100% more checks, which would obviously blow that 1-to-1 replacement rate out of the water.
Yeah. Let's talk about your approach in your portfolio. You kind of hinted at it. We talk a lot about the sustainability environment and kind of where the world's going right now. And it seems like, and you've heard smart folks say, like the next few unicorns are coming out of climate tech or clean tech. I'm curious, as someone who's in the trenches every day, is that a perception that you think is real? Is that a talking point that, some of the big funds are espousing because they've got some big investments in these spaces? What's your take on it?
Yeah. So listen, I think, the last 2 years have been all about AI, and that's where most of the multi-billion-dollar valuations have come from. Whether they're going to be real and sustainable, I think is maybe anybody's bet. Some of them are probably just like any other industry. Probably the vast majority aren't. And there'll be a reckoning probably in the next couple of years as they figure out, do they have a real business here? Is there real commercial sustainability?
Right.
I think on the climate side is going to be the same. I think, there are a lot of businesses that raised during the bubble at pretty high valuations in 21, 22. And some of them have had to like really retreat in terms of thinking about, doing RIFs, reduction in force, layoffs, having to raise capital at a lower valuation, down rounds. And they've had to really figure out how to actually get to a product market fit much faster. And so I do believe that, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act and all the money coming into climate, I think it is an amazing private-public opportunity to build the next set of great American companies that are doing kind of this intersection of climate tech and maybe what A16Z is calling American dynamism, or what I think General Catalyst is calling industrial resilience. Like this idea of critical onshoring of chemicals, food, materials, and supply chains here in the US versus China, Russia, or outside our borders. It's helping create jobs. It's a very bipartisan issue, which I think that if you look at, Trump wants to potentially strip back a lot of the IRA, but his Republican colleagues, I think, that are benefiting in certain states from new jobs and new money coming into their districts are very much against that notion, right? And so to me, I feel like, yes, I think there are going to be quite a few more unicorns coming in the climate space, but whether they're called climate companies or like onshoring or whatever you want to call it, like the peace dividends of them scaling their technology here in the US is going to allow for hopefully a healthier climate, a healthier planet. But in the interim, they're going to have to build something that gets a product market fit very, very rapidly because the investors are not going to have patience otherwise.
We've talked a lot about this topic. I think, the notion of designing companies and actually thinking about some of the brilliant product managers that we've had as guests, like Matt Rogers, the creator of Mill, who was the founder at Nest also, who talks about like, you've got to build a company and build a product, that aligns the economic incentives and that product market fit with his actual mission objective of solving for climate change. And like, once you do that, once you've aligned that mission with the actual economic scale, all of a sudden you're off to the races. If you can do that, if you can find that intersection perfectly, which I think Matt probably has one of the best minds to do, that's it.
Yeah. And, if I can plug one of our own companies, Solugen, right, which is one of these unicorns in the climate space, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I led their seed round, about 7.5 years ago. They were coming out of Y Combinator. My seed memo that I wrote up for them really doesn't mention climate tech. It's a biotech investment at the seed stage because what they're doing is they're manufacturing chemicals using biology, enzymes, instead of petroleum, right? And so the petrochemical industry is they use petroleum as a catalyst to actually make millions of different chemical formulations. And if we can do that using biology without petroleum, yes, there's going to be a lot of positive benefits from divorcing ourselves from the oil industry. And so in recent rounds for that company, a bunch of climate investors ended up coming in and or large crossover funds that have climate sleeves that are very interested in what they're doing. But if you actually look at what they're trying to do, they're building factories in Texas and Minnesota and other parts of our country and bringing critical materials and chemicals that are typically manufactured outside of our borders here into the United States. And so this is why like the whole thing around American dynamism, industrial resilience is probably, there's such overlap with what's going on with climate that I think because there's been so much heat in climate and some kind of failures as well, you see a lot of founders that are kind of figuring out, oh, maybe I should be thinking about how to frame my company and my value prop differently in this year, 2024, than I would have in 2021. Just given where some of the VCs, the big VCs, the Magnificent Seven of the VC industry, the A16Zs of the world, the Sequoias of the world, where they're focusing their investments, right? YC just made their first defense-oriented investment. And so I think there's going to be a lot more interest, whether it's defense or whether it's just how do I actually bring jobs to the United States? Again, that is a very bipartisan issue that a lot of people believe in.
Yeah. It's so funny how storytelling becomes such a important part of the startup game, whether it's on the fundraising side or, it's funny you mentioned Solugen. We followed them and I love them. And they were actually mentioned on the show previously by the founder of Aether, who we had on the show. These technologies, it must be just so fun to be in your shoes because you talk to these folks and you hear what they're doing and it sounds like science fiction. It's so cool. And every day you get to look at these deals. Like, what are you looking at now that's getting you really excited? What's kind of out there that's going to blow our minds?
Yeah, but I mean, before I want to talk about science fiction for a second, because I think it's really critical to understand which companies are trying to espouse science fiction versus science reality.
I like that.
Because as a seed investor, I cannot be believing in something that is going to commercialize 10 years from now. That it does not work with a venture fund.
Yeah.
Because by Series A, those investors that want to write a $20, $30 million lead check in your round, they want to see product market fit. They want to see a couple of contracts. They want to see your first product built and actually producing revenue, and you've identified what the business model is going to look like, right? And so a lot of scientific founders that come to me, maybe they're spinning out of a lab or they're at some university or they're at another company, I could tell that they're not necessarily ready to be CEOs and start a company because they talk about projects and experiments and, trying to go raise a $250K SBIR from the government to go and that'll give them 2.5 years of runway. And you're just like, okay, you're not thinking at the speed and the sense of urgency required to build a company. You're thinking about this as a science project. That's fine, especially if you think that, we need 2 to 5 years of work in the lab before spinning out a company. Come back to me when you're ready to start a company in that sense. And so I'm actively screening for that. People who actually want to build companies versus building projects. But I'm probably going to give you a non-answer on your question, unfortunately. But in terms of what ideas I'm really excited about, when I get excited about ideas and not founders, I make mistakes. So I have to believe that the founders are amazing. Like they're technically and commercially gifted. They've got that sense of urgency. They could be true company builders. And then they're magnets for 3 types of people: customers, talent, and investors. What you're looking for are people who can actually sell not only products, but shares in their company to people like me, right? And so I want to kind of get that from these founders when I meet them, because when I feel like I'm really jiving with a set of founders, but I'm really not sure what their eventual product is going to be or what the go-to-market or business model is going to look like. 9 times out of 10, an amazing founding team will figure out those questions very rapidly. Whereas if it's the opposite, it's like, oh, I've always wanted this to exist in the world. It's an amazing idea. I would buy it myself. I want to invest in this company. The team's fine, but I want to invest in this idea. That's when you make mistakes, because if you're not in love with the team, if they're tier B, right? The whole adage of tier B attracts tier C people, like that whole thing ends up becoming reality very, very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it is a trend you hear repeated. Just invest in people more than anything else. Invest in the people.
Because again, these hard tech companies I'm investing in, climate tech and biotech, they've got to raise quite a bit of capital before they get to some level of revenue and cash flow profitability, usually 100 million plus. And so they're going to be reliant on venture capital for a very long period of time versus like software companies, AI companies that are like, yes, maybe you should only raise a couple $1 million with a couple of founders and a couple of engineers and go try to iterate and launch something that makes sense in the world, get to a couple million of ARR, and then you can actually decide whether you want to raise capital or build a different type of business, right? Whereas in hard tech, you have to rely on VCs. And because of that, you need founders that can like really be magnets for all those people that I mentioned.
Right. I know that, I mean, I've heard you talk about this intersection in your portfolio of climate tech and how it kind of evolved out of human health and the human element. And I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about that connection as you see it and how that's kind of expanded your scope and your mission.
Yeah. So like I said, I started in digital health. Like Obamacare had just passed in 2013. The EHRs, the electronic health records and medical records, were coming online as a mandate. So we started seeing these amazing companies get started, benchling, et cetera, on the life sciences lab side. And then we started looking at synthetic biology, which was really going into like deep science, an area that I don't have academic expertise in at the time. But these founders, they just started educating you about where the world is going. And it just got me thinking. It's like, okay, there's some real opportunities here, maybe even outside of therapeutics and diagnostics, outside of human health. So I wrote a blog post a long time ago on Medium called The Non-Human Applications of Biology. And I talk about food and chemicals and material science. I think you've had Charlie from Checkerspot on your podcast.
I was going to bring him up.
That's one of my companies, right? Pavle at Aether, he's one of my founders as well. Like these are all founders that are working in biology, but not in the healthcare setting, not in the medical setting. They're using biology to build something physical in the real world that is in one of these other categories of interest. And all of those are, I should say, the vast majority of those have a climate angle to them. Because if they can actually replace something that's in the petroleum world, which is what a lot of these companies are doing, they're actually going to be able to create something positive for our planet. And so, yeah, I started making, my first investment in this space was Solugen, actually. It was March of 2017, and these founders, like Gaurav, is an MD, PhD. He was studying cancer at MD Anderson at UT Southwestern in Houston and discovered this enzyme that was coming out of pancreatic cancer cells. And it was producing hydrogen peroxide, and he was really shocked by that. And he called up his friend at MIT who was studying catalytic engineering and also trying to produce hydrogen peroxide, but through metal catalysts like gold, palladium, etc., which is kind of the normal way of doing it. And he's like, how are you able to find this in living cells? This is crazy. And so the two of them got together and then they built their first bioreactor together. And when I invested, they were actually doing revenue. So talk about sense of urgency. These guys were doing like $10,000 or $20,000 of monthly revenue selling hydrogen peroxide to pool owners and spas and other folks that wanted a replacement for chlorine in their products, because hydrogen peroxide is a lot easier on the skin. And it was obviously much more bio and climate friendly. And so, when I started thinking about that space, I was just like, wow, this is a really great category that doesn't have a ton of regulation versus, if I invest in a therapeutics company, it's going to be 5 to 10 years before they even sometimes hit clinical trial, and then another 5 years after that before commercialization. It's not because I won't invest in therapeutics. There are definitely some great companies out there that I've invested in, but I liked the fast time to market with some of these businesses and how it aligned with how I think they needed to raise capital from a relatively impatient VC industry.
Yeah. How did Charlie and Checkerspot come to you guys?
So I had invested in a Illumina accelerator company earlier and looked at a couple of when I was at A16Z. So Illumina Ventures, the big sequencing company in San Diego, they have an accelerator program for startups where they give them some money, they give them some lab space. They give, I think, 12 to 15 weeks of cohort time to kind of refine their product, refine their pitch. And then they kind of have a demo day and they present to investors. And so I got to meet Charlie and Scott through the Illumina Accelerator program and ended up co-leading their seed round way back in the day. And so I love kind of what their story was all about. These were two founders from Solazyme, who was kind of the old failure of clean tech 1.0. You notice I call it climate tech versus clean tech. I feel like it's a very simple distinction to kind of separate the two eras. But like that was the clean tech 1.0 era. There were companies that were just building massive $50, $100, $200 million factories in different parts of the world without much customer demand and then failing. They basically kind of mismatched, the supply and demand. And so Charlie and Scott saw that because Solazyme was one of those and decided to start a company that was going to be reliant on working with enterprise customers from day one to understand their needs and what they could use using their algae products. And so I love those two guys. They were like Charlie as a commercial genius, Scott as a technical genius. It's the exact combination you want in a co-founding team.
Yeah. And such cool products. I've skied on Wonders when I was out in Utah. So they're great skis.
Yes. That is, that's the whole point. Like you're not giving up performance. The whole point is it's actually an improvement in performance. And that's what they've been able to prove with so many of these skiers. Yeah.
Yeah. And Aether, we talked about it already, but I'm also just kind of curious as an investor, like, again, my mind was blown in that conversation. He's you could just feel the genius emanating from him. But there's so many possible applications. I'm curious if there's something like, when you looked at it as an investor, like beyond saying, of course, it can scale all of these places, were there particular lanes that you're like, and that's the one that could be the one that we're most excited about, or this is the one that's going to really hit first? How did you look at that investment case, and what do you kind of give us your hot take on it?
Yeah, Pavle had just left UC Santa Cruz, I believe, and I can't remember how old he was, but he was really young. He was probably 21 when we invested. And as you know, like as you talk to him, right? He is just one of the sharpest people I've met in my life. And he's driven. He's sincere. He asks questions. He's very coachable. I think I was just like, I met him and I was like, I have to invest in this human. He's incredible. And so definitely Aether has taken a couple of different terms over the last 7 or 8 years that we've invested in, but he's found something that's amazing at this point as a market opportunity. And so to your question earlier, like I don't necessarily want to overstate to founders where I think their technologies could go, because they're the ones on the front line talking to customers. They're on the front lines building their product and trying to figure out what applications it could be used for, because most of the companies I invest in have a product that can be used in innumerable markets and innumerable applications, right? It's almost like the problem for most technical founders is saying no to most of them and focusing on just one idea. Not even 3, like one idea and one product, and getting it out the door and trying to get that to like a 20 to 30 million revenue run rate before even thinking about the next product. right? I think that's a real challenge for technical founders. But I think Pavle did a lot of research in the market, realized that there's some great opportunities in front of him and like latched onto them. And so I just kind of try to help edit the path where I can by asking questions and trying to understand where we are on both of those knobs, commercial and technical, and make sure that we're aligned so that do we think we can build what these customers want? If not, let's kind of figure out the flip of that and go figure out what we can build for which set of customers.
I've read a bit about your founders' dinners. And so I'm curious of what is it like when you get all these minds together? How did this initiative evolve and what's it been like to do those?
Yeah, I started doing them again this year. During COVID, I was kind of holed up. We had a baby during COVID, and my wife didn't want me to travel for a little bit because it was just kind of insane at home. And so the last couple of years, I started really kind of obviously trying to get more engaged with founders and bringing them together because what I heard from our teams was that, they're siloed. They're sitting in an office with their own teams, thinking about the same thing every day and talking to customers and their engineers about building, but they're missing out on some of the insights, especially as these companies may be in like Y Combinator or Illumina's accelerator for 12 weeks. They have those like random, water cooler chats with other founders who are completely unrelated to what they're working on. And some really cool ideas can come from that. Or how do you sell into a customer? Oh, you've talked to somebody at Coca-Cola. How did you get that sale done? Oh, we were selling software to them, but we did this and this. Wow. Yeah, well, that's great. Like we should think about that strategy, right? And so that's obviously missing after these accelerators are completed.
Right.
And these guys are just holed up in their own rooms for most of the time. So I brought these dinners together where they can actually have conversations and chatting and like learning about one another. And there's been quite a few connections made post dinners. And that's like the best thing that I can hope for.
I'm sure it's very cool. I had an entrepreneur's breakfast club in LA 10 years ago, and it was some of the most interesting. And sometimes it's practical. It's how do you make the sale? And sometimes it's just inspirational. You see someone that did the thing and, had the exit or whatever. And those are just, it's nice to have those moments of connection with folks.
That's right. And across different areas, right? And so I did a biotech dinner and different therapeutics and diagnostic founders were coming together. One of them was working on IVF, like reinventing IVF using a new stem cell technology. And the other one was actually doing like polygenic embryo screening during IVF, which is trying to help pick the best embryo to implant. So you can imagine all the chats that they had in terms of women's health. And then the other guy was like working on the pill for men called Your Choice Therapeutics, which is dropping spermatogenesis levels below fertility. And you're actually just firing blanks at that point because we need a non-hormonal male contraceptive because we don't have one in the market today. And so there's just so many interesting ideas being thrown out at this dinner. Like it was incredible.
That's cool. I mean, when you think about all the technologies, all the ideas where your fingerprint is on them, they're portfolio companies, or they're just conversations that you've nurtured for a long time, founders you've worked with for a long time, and you think about kind of the impact they will have on the world, potentially. What do you think your legacy will look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some LPs that have like ESG or like climate or environmental sleeves in their funds. And they were kind of wanting to invest, but they wanted me to like fill out a full form every year about the actual impact that I was making with these companies. And they wanted me to actually send that to our founders, like who's turning off the lights at night, who's doing DEI hiring as well. I was just like, no, I don't want to deal with that. Like the short answer to your question is that if I am successful in finding like out of 20 companies in a fund, maybe 2 or 3, so in my career, can I find 5 or 10 companies or more, hopefully, but let's call it 5 to 10 companies that really makes a dent in terms of creating sustainable, long-term public companies that create jobs and opportunity and actually solve critical problems for human society that may, hopefully, positively impact our human health as well as our planetary health. That would be amazing to me. But I think it all starts with building amazingly successful companies. I do not want to oversteer toward certain climate impacts because I don't know what the companies are going to look like 10 years from now. The products are going to change, the ideas are going to change, the teams are going to change, the customers might be different than when I first invested at the seed stage. So if I'm still focused, like every other investor, other VC, on company builders, magnets for those people that I talked about before, then all those other awesome peace dividends of scaling amazing companies will come about, and hopefully my legacy will be based on that.
Yeah, I like that. Last question. We do see every day, whether it's about climate change or human health, more often than not, the front page is dominated by stories that are negative, that are really, I think it's hard to stay motivated to go out there and like try to think big and do big things, especially when it is a 7 to 10 year horizon to build a product that's going to actually do the thing, right? How do you, whether it's, in your own investments, whether it's with the CEOs of your portfolio companies, how do you keep folks focused on defeating that defeatism and, despite it, doubling down on the hope and kind of the conviction it takes to build the product for the big change?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to take it one quarter at a time, 1 year at a time. And I think that's how you create progress and you create real sense of urgency with teams. Because like everybody knows, like hopefully they set out their mission very clearly. But if that's a given, what you're doing is you're setting up your OKRs, right? Your objectives and key results, which is something John Doerr came up with at Google a long time ago and is used by most companies now in the Valley. It's like, what are your OKRs every quarter? Are you meeting them? Are you exceeding them? And like, how are we making sure that we're continuously pushing our technical, commercial, and team milestones forward so that we can actually hit some of these goals? And so there will be short-term challenges. How do we kind of overcome them? How do we push them aside and think about other opportunities that might be in front of us? But we're constantly taking it one quarter at a time, and that's how we make progress. So maybe it's an overstatement, but I think if you do that, I think you have a lot of success that you're in your control, because if you're really measuring your success on that level of time period, I think you're going to be successful.
Yeah. How do you eat the elephant? One bite at a time.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Awesome. Huge thanks to Zal Bilimoria for joining us on Consensus in Conversation this week. You can find out more about Refactor and read up on all the amazing companies in their portfolio at their website, refactor.com. Or you can connect with Zal himself on LinkedIn. We'll have all the links for you in the show notes. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love the feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. It helps us continue bringing you more awesome talks with business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new and very special conversation. I promise it's one you're not going to want to miss. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Herrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.